Hello there, and welcome to Beyond Earth Stories. This is a place where curiosity meets calm, where we let science drift slowly into the night like a gentle tide. If you've just found this channel, I'm glad you're here. Settle in, dim the lights, and allow me to be your companion for the next few hours as we wander through the deep past. Tonight, we'll be listening for the voices of ice, the frozen echoes that shaped not just the land, but the very core of what it means to be human. I've often wondered what it would feel like to stand at the very beginning of our story, not in a cave or a village, not even in a forest or a plain, but in the silence of an ancient winter. Imagine it a wind crossing open grassland, sharp and endless, carrying no sound but its own. The horizon is wide, unbroken, and the cold is so deep that it doesn't just touch the skin, it presses into the bone. Somewhere in that frozen breath, something remarkable is waiting to awaken. I still remember the first time I stood before a glacial boulder in northern Europe. It sat in the middle of a green meadow, enormous and strangely out of place, like a suitcase left behind by a traveler who never returned. Children were climbing over it, laughing, while birds perched on its smooth surface. The nearest mountains were hundreds of miles away, yet this boulder carried the quiet memory of ice. It had been dragged here by a glacier thousands of years ago and gently released when the ice melted back. Looking at it, I felt something stir inside me, an almost unsettling awareness that my own story was tied to its journey, that I was in some hidden way an echo of that ice. That feeling has never left me. When I read about ancient climates or walk across landscapes shaped by glaciers, I can't help but imagine my ancestors moving through them. They didn't know they were living in an ice age. They had no maps, no satellites, no mathematics to calculate the Earth's tilt or orbit. What they had was instinct hunger, fear, and the slow fire of intelligence catching hold. And yet, from those cold winds and shifting skies, a species emerged, our species. The Earth began to shiver, roughly 2.5 million years ago. It wasn't sudden. There was no apocalyptic snowfall, no moment when the world froze solid overnight. Instead, it was a long exhale, a slow tightening of winter's grip. Summers grew shorter. Snow lingered longer on the high ground. Glaciers thickened in the north and began their slow advance. The seas stirred restlessly as if they sensed what was coming. From then on, the planet would slip again and again into cycles of ice and thaw, a rhythm so vast that it would become the background music to our evolution. If you step back far enough in your imagination, you can almost see the Earth itself as a restless sleeper, turning from side to side, caught in a cosmic rhythm it cannot escape. Its orbit wobbles ever so slightly. Its tilt shifts by a few degrees. Its path around the sun stretches and tightens like a heartbeat. These movements, so slow they take tens of thousands of years to complete, are enough to alter the balance of sunlight falling on the northern continents. When conditions line up just right, snow refuses to melt. It builds year upon year until ice sheets spread like white continents across the land. That was the stage on which our story began. Africa was not yet the dry expanse we know today. It was a patchwork of forests and savannas, rivers and wetlands that came and went with the shifting climate. Early hominins walked there, upright apes with hands quick to grasp and eyes already searching for patterns. They felt the changes in the rains, the long droughts, the sudden chill. Slowly, in ways too subtle for any one generation to notice, they began to adapt. They stood taller, walked farther, chipped stones into edges, and carried fire in their memory even before they carried it in their hands. I like to think about one of those first evenings when our ancestors sat together at the edge of a plains, the cold seeping into the ground beneath them. Maybe lightning had struck a tree earlier that day, leaving behind a smoldering branch. They would have drawn near, tentative at first, then closer. Heat, light, protection. It was all there, glowing in the dark. The wind howled across the steppe, but for the first time, something else answered it, the crackle of fire, the soft murmur of voices. In that fragile circle of warmth, humanity was beginning to take shape. And it is here, in this meeting of ice and fire, silence and voice, that the true story begins. The glaciers were not just sculptors of mountains and valleys. They were sculptors of minds. Every cycle of advance and retreat demanded resilience. Every drought and flood forced new ways of thinking. Every migration across an exposed land bridge or through a shrinking forest planted seeds of memory, imagination, and cooperation. The ice pressed against us, tested us, and in the pressure we became something more. The boulder in that meadow, the one I touched years ago, still sits where the glacier left it. But when I look at it now, I don't see a rock. I see a mirror. I see a reminder that the world we know, the warm summers, the green fields, the predictable seasons, is an exception, not the rule. Our bones, our thoughts, even the rhythm of our dreams carry the echo of frozen centuries. And the question that lingers, the one that will guide us forward, tonight is simple but profound. How did the age of ice make us human? I think the answer begins with listening not just to science, not just to fossils or isotopes or sediment cores, but to the land itself. To the wind that still carries a hint of ancient chill, to the stones that remember being dragged across continents, to the silence that waits in every frozen valley. If we listen carefully, we might just hear the beginning of our own story hidden in that cold breath. And once we hear it, we cannot help but follow it forward. The first time I learned about the Earth's long, slow cycles of cold, I was sitting in a quiet library, staring at a diagram of orbital paths. At first glance, it looked abstract, just lines and numbers, but then I realized what it meant. Our planet is never still. It tilts, it wobbles, it stretches its orbit like a dancer swaying in slow motion. Over tens of thousands of years, these subtle shifts decide whether summers melt the snow or leave it behind. And when the snow lingers, the ice grows. That was the hidden metronome of deep time, and when I finally grasped it, I felt as though I was hearing a rhythm that had been beating beneath my feet all my life without me noticing. 2.5 million years ago, that rhythm began to lean toward cold. The changes were gradual, like the dimming of a lamp that you don't notice until the room is already dark. The continents were drifting toward their modern arrangement. North and South America collided, creating a land bridge that reshaped ocean currents. Warmth that had once flowed freely between the Atlantic and the Pacific was trapped and redirected. Antarctica, isolated at the bottom of the world, was wrapped in currents that kept it locked in ice. Greenland, too, was beginning to freeze, while high mountains like the Himalayas and the Rockies pulled carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as their rocks weathered. Each piece alone might not have mattered, but together they formed the perfect stage for ice to spread. I often picture Earth at that moment like a restless giant taking a deeper breath. The ocean stirred, clouds shifted, rain patterns danced away from where they had fallen for ages, and across the continents, forests shrank. Where there had once been dense green canopy, clearings opened. Savanna stretched further. Lakes and rivers came and went, appearing like mirages and vanishing again. It was a world of constant adjustment, and our ancestors had no choice but to adjust with it. Imagine Africa, then not the dry Sahara we know, but a land that pulsed like a living lung. Grasslands spread wide, broken by ribbons of water, and scattered forests. Herds of elephants, antelope, and giraffe moved in great migrations, and among them walked the first humans. They weren't fully us yet. They were smaller, their tools simple, their fire uncertain. But their eyes were bright, forward-facing, searching for patterns in a shifting world. I sometimes imagine sitting beside one of them at dusk, watching the sun sail behind a line of acacia trees. The air would be cooler than we expect, the horizon streaked with dust, and the sense of impermanence heavy. Everything could change by the next season. The glaciers themselves were far away at first, locked in the north, but distance didn't protect Africa from their reach. As ice sheets advanced and retreated, they pulled at the whole planet's climate like a tide. Rain shifted south or north. Wetlands dried, forests thinned. The comfortable life in trees became harder to sustain, and so some of our ancestors climbed down. That decision, whether by chance or necessity, changed everything. Walking on two legs freed their hands. Hands that once gripped branches began to carry stones, dig roots, throw objects, and eventually chip edges into tools. Their legs grew stronger, able to travel longer distances across open ground. Their posture lifted their eyes higher, letting them scan the horizon for predators or prey. And inside their skulls, something even more extraordinary was happening. Their brains were growing not all at once, but slowly over generations. As new challenges demanded new solutions, I can almost see it. A small group of early humans crouched near a patch of dry grass, chipping stones together. The first strike is clumsy, the second too shallow, but eventually one edge flakes just right, sharp enough to cut. They test it on a root, on a bone. It works. A small victory, but revolutionary. A tool is more than stone. It is memory made solid. It carries the lesson of yesterday into tomorrow. And with that edge, survival becomes just a little more likely. Over time, those small victories accumulated. Tools grew sharper, more varied. Stones were shaped into axes, scrapers' points. Bones and wood were added to the toolkit. At some point, fire was not only discovered, but kept. Perhaps it began with lightning igniting dry brush. At first, our ancestors might have been afraid, keeping their distance. But eventually, they learned to bring embers back to protect them, to feed them. Fire meant warmth on cold nights, safety against predators, cooked food that released more energy for growing brains. Around firelight, something else may have begun to form community. The glow of flames drew people together, not just for heat, but for sharing. food stories, comfort. I sometimes wonder if laughter itself was born beside the first campfires, a sound that broke the silence of the cold. The world they faced was unforgiving. Glaciers advanced across Europe and Asia, carving valleys, grinding mountains into dust, lowering sea levels by hundreds of feet. Where the ice didn't reach, the cold still did. Grasslands spread in place of forests, creating vast hunting grounds, but also harsh exposed environments. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, and saber-toothed cats thrived, but so did hardship. To survive, our ancestors had to become not just toolmakers, but travelers. They followed rivers, coastlines, and herds across continents. Homo erectus. One of our early kin left Africa more than 1 million years ago, walking into unfamiliar lands, carrying fire and stone tools. They were true wanderers, the first to step beyond the cradle of humanity. When I think about them, I don't see faceless figures in animal skins. I imagine parents teaching children how to strike sparks, hunters working together to bring down prey, families staring at the night sky, perhaps already wondering what those distant lights were. Their lives were short and dangerous, but they carried inside them the beginnings of what we call humanity. And all the while, the Earth's cold breath continued. Glaciers advanced and retreated in slow pulses, shaping not just the land, but the fate of every creature. Valleys were carved into U-shapes, rivers were redirected, fertile soil was spread by grinding ice. The land itself became a kind of book written by glaciers, and our ancestors were learning to read it. They followed animal tracks across snowy plains. They found water in frozen landscapes. They noticed the changing patterns of plants. Every adaptation was a response to the ice, and every response pushed them closer to us. It's humbling to think that the very challenges that could have destroyed us were the ones that sculpted us. If the world had stayed warm and stable, perhaps we would have remained clever apes, comfortable in our forests, never forced to stretch beyond what was easy. But the ice refused comfort. It demanded ingenuity. It punished complacency. And in that relentless testing, something extraordinary emerged. Sometimes when I walk through a modern city, I think about that. Skyscrapers of steel and glass, highways full of cars, satellites orbiting overhead. All of it is in some deep sense the child of cold winds that blew millions of years ago. Without the ice pressing against us, without the droughts and floods and migrations, it forced, perhaps there would be no cities, no language, no stories. In the silence of glacial winters, humanity was born. And so when I touch a glacial boulder or stand in a valley carved by ice, I don't just see geology. I see memory. I see the faint outlines of the first tools, the first fires, the first migrations. The earth itself remembers, and if we're quiet enough, so do we. The closer I move in imagination to those early landscapes, the more I realize how fragile survival must have been. Picture a family of early humans stepping cautiously through tall grass on the African plain. The air is dry, the sun heavy, and yet a chill lingers in the mornings that reminds them the world is colder than it once was. They are not the only wanderers here. Herds of elephants rumble in the distance, antelopes scatter across the horizon, and predators wait in the shadows. To live in this place is to live at the edge of fear and hunger, but also at the edge of possibility. This was the world where our ancestors began their first great journey. They did not know they were writing history, but their footprints stretched farther than any creature before them. Little by little, they left the forests and rivers of Africa, following herds chasing seasons, searching for water. Some crossed into the Middle East, some reached Asia, and others would one day find Europe. Their spread was not a migration in the sense we think of today. No maps, no destination, only the slow pull of survival. Yet in time, those slow steps would carry them across the entire planet. One of the most remarkable of these travelers was Homo erectus. They were taller and stronger than their ancestors, with legs built for distance and a mind increasingly built for innovation. They carried fire where they went, not always tamed, but increasingly understood. They shaped stone into hand axes tools so effective that their basic design would remain unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years. Wherever they moved, they left behind fragments of themselves, hearts, chipped stones, bones marked with the scars of butchery. Their presence was like a quiet drumbeat, steady, insistent, spreading across continents. I try to imagine what it must have felt like to stand at the edge of an unfamiliar valley, looking out over a world with no human voices beyond your own group. The silence must have been immense. Every rustle of grass could be danger. Every animal track could be food or death. Yet they walked on. That courage, or maybe that necessity, is part of us still. As the millennia passed, the ice continued its rhythm. Glaciers advanced further into Europe and Asia, carving the land and chilling the air. Forests retreated, replaced by open steppes where giant animals thrived. Woolly mammoths grazed in herds, their massive tusks curving like frozen crescents against the sky. Saber-toothed cats crouched in tall grass, their long fangs glinting. Giant ground sloths lumbered across the Americas, and short-faced bears roamed taller than a man even when standing on all fours. It was a world of giants, a living bestiary that seems almost mythical to us now. But to our ancestors, it was daily reality. What fascinates me most is how humans adapted not just physically, but mentally to this world. Strength alone could not outmatch a mammoth. Speed alone could not outrun a predator. What gave humans an edge was cooperation and imagination. I think about a group of hunters crouched together in the snow planning. One points toward a herd in the distance. Another sketches shapes in the dirt with a stick tracing a strategy. They are not just reacting to the world, they are imagining futures, rehearsing them, and then acting. That ability to picture what might happen before it did was a quiet revolution. It allowed small, fragile humans to stand against enormous odds. And with planning came memory. Stories may have been born here around the firelight after a hunt. An elder might have recounted how to track a herd, which valleys were dangerous, which plants healed wounds. Knowledge passed, not in blood, but in words, layering one generation upon the next. The ice forced them to learn quickly, but it also forced them to remember. And memory, shared across time, became culture. The animals themselves were teachers. Watching mammoths migrate taught humans where to find water and grass. Observing predators showed them the power of patience and ambush. Even the cold itself gave lessons, which caves offered shelter, which stones sparked fire, which skins made the warmest coverings. In a way, the entire Ice Age was a school, and every creature, human or not, was both student and teacher. Yet the cost was high. Many groups did not survive. Populations rose and fell with the climate. A sudden drought could wipe out a valley's inhabitants. A harsh winter could starve a family in days. Extinction hovered close, and yet somehow against those odds, some survived. We are their descendants, carrying forward the unbroken chain of resilience. When I walk through a museum today and look at a hand axe chipped 500,000 years ago, I don't just see stone. I see a life, a hand striking again and again until the edge was right. I see a group gathering around a fire, passing the tool from one to another. I see the determination of wanderers stepping into unknown lands, guided only by the memory of the last successful hunt and the hope of another. These were the first steps into the cold, the first great wanderings, the beginning of a story that would one day cover the entire earth. Fire. I keep returning to it in my mind because without it, I doubt our story would have survived the cold. Imagine an Ice Age night, the wind knifing across an open plain, the stars sharp as crystal above, and a small group of humans huddled in darkness. Without fire that night is only fear predators circling unseen cold, seeping into bone hunger gnawing at the belly. But with fire, everything changes. I picture the first spark catching maybe from a lightning strike, maybe from stones struck together by chance. At first, it would have been terrifying. Flames hiss wood cracks, shadows dance in strange shapes. But then, warmth spreads outward. The chill lifts from skin. The circle of light pushes back the unknown. And in that circle, something deeper awakens belonging. Fire became more than survival. It became a gathering place, a center of gravity. The firelight let people see one another's faces in ways the sun never allowed. By night, with work and danger, paused voices softened. I imagine the first stories told here, not myths yet, not art but simple memory. Which valley held the herd last season? How a storm broke the trees by the river? Who was lost to the winter and who endured? These stories were not entertainment. They were maps, survival guides, threads stitching together past and future. But in the act of telling something new was born meaning. Cooking too transformed us. Raw roots and meat take hours of chewing and yield little. But roasted marrow softened tubers, cooked grains, these released energy, quickly fueling growing brains. Scientists today believe our large calorie-hungry brains were only possible because fire freed us from the slow grind of raw food. I find that thought extraordinary. Every idea I speak, every memory you hold is in some sense powered by 1,000,000 years of shared firelight meals. And with food came time. Fire allowed evenings of safety where people could sit without constant watchfulness. Children could play within the circle of light. Elders could teach. Lovers could whisper. The rhythm of life stretched beyond daylight into a new dimension. Night became not just silence, but community. It's tempting to think of these early fires as primitive, but when I imagine them, I see sophistication. Keeping fire alive required knowledge, how to shield embers from rain, how to choose wood that burns steady, how to carry coals from camp to camp. A flame was both fragile and eternal, a living thread passed from hand to hand. I picture a mother bending over glowing embers at dawn, breathing gently until sparks bloom again. That breath was as important to our survival as any spear or shelter. The power of fire reshaped our relationship with the world. We were no longer at the mercy of every cold night or stalking predator. We could alter our environment if only in small circles at first. But those circles expanded. Camps grew larger. Hunts grew more organized. Bonds deepened. To share fire was to share trust. Even now, when I sit before a campfire, I feel something ancient stir in me, a calm, a focus, as though my mind remembers nights long before history. And then, of course, came imagination. Flames twist and flicker, casting shapes on cave walls. Shadows dance into beasts, into spirits, into figures that resemble ourselves. In that flickering light, art may have been born. The painted caves of Europe, the carved ochre of Africa, the hand stencils of Indonesia, all may trace their lineage to moments when firelight turned stone into canvas. To see more than what is there, to give shape to memory, and dream is one of the most human acts we know. And fire was its stage. I often wonder if laughter, too, was born beside the fire. Think of the release it must have given after a day of hunger and fear, to laugh together in safety, to find joy in voices and faces glowing orange against the dark. Laughter is as much survival as fire. It binds us, eases tension, turns strangers into kin. Perhaps those first jokes were about the hunt, or about the stubbornness of weather, or simply about the strangeness of being alive. Whatever they were, they carried forward, and we carry them still. What's striking is how much of our humanity crystallized in that glow. Cooking, storytelling, art, laughter, trust, all took shape around fire. In the frozen silence of Ice Age nights, fire was more than heat. It was the forge in which our identity was cast. So when I imagine those long ago evenings, I don't just see survival. I see a species stepping into itself. A group of fragile apes became something else, human beings capable of memory, of invention, of community. Fire was not only our tool, it was our mirror showing us who we were becoming. The fire carried us further than warmth and food. It gave us the courage to wander. Once humans had the means to survive the cold nights, the world itself seemed to open. Our ancestors became travelers, drifting across continents in ways no other creature could. They were not the fastest nor the strongest, but they had endurance and imagination. Those two gifts carried them into landscapes shaped by ice and wind, places that seemed uninhabitable, yet became home. When I think of these wanderers, I see the long steppe stretching across Eurasia, grasses bending under relentless winds, the horizon never ending. In that vast space lived herds of animals that to us now seem almost mythical. Mammoths marched in slow, deliberate lines. Woolly rhinoceroses grazed where rivers cut through frost. Wild horses thundered across plains, their hooves drumming a rhythm into the ground. Among them moved the hunters, small figures compared to their prey, but armed with sharp tools, fire, and the willingness to work together. Not all of them were our direct ancestors. There were cousins, parallel branches of humanity that walked beside us. Neanderthals with broad bodies, built for the cold-skilled hunters of ice-clad Europe. Denisovans, shadowy figures, known mostly through traces of their DNA, who spread across Asia and into islands we later reached. These weren't beasts or half-humans, but people in their own right. Intelligent, resourceful, adaptive. They lit fires. Two-shaped tools cared for their young and their dead. When I hold a replica of a Neanderthal spear point in my hand, I feel as though I am shaking hands across time with a relative I'll never meet, but whose blood still runs in me. And that's the truth. We carry them with us. A small percentage of Neanderthal DNA lives in most non-African people today, and Denisovan genes persist in populations from Asia to Oceania. They didn't vanish entirely. They became part of us. I like to imagine encounters where fires burned at the edges of camps, where Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens looked across the flames at each other, recognizing in those eyes something familiar. Maybe there was rivalry, even violence. But maybe there was curiosity, maybe even love. We know from the evidence that children were born of those meetings. Our species is not just us alone, it is the memory of many. The wanderers carried not only bloodlines but knowledge. They learned which valleys were safe, which rivers carried fish, which caves gave shelter. They mapped the world with their feet one step at a time, and those maps lived in their memory, passed along in stories and gestures. I think about how it must have felt to arrive at a glacier's edge for the first time, a wall of ice stretching further than sight, taller than trees, groaning with ancient weight. To some, it must have been terrifying, to others, awe-inspiring. To me, even now, glaciers feel alive, like sleeping giants breathing in silence. Our ancestors stood before them and knew they were fragile in comparison. And yet, they stayed. They adapted. They found ways to live where few creatures could. The steppe itself was both harsh and generous. Winters were long, but summers burst with life. Herds migrated, and with them, people followed. The hunters became nomads, learning to track not just animals, but the seasons themselves. They moved in groups, sometimes small, sometimes larger, bound together by necessity. Cooperation was not optional. It was survival. One hunter alone could not bring down a mammoth, but a group with strategy, patience, and courage could. In those hunts, humanity sharpened its greatest tool, unity. I often imagine walking beside them, feeling the crunch of frost, underfoot the air burning cold in the lungs. The silence broken by the sound of a mammoth's trumpet, the distant howl of wolves, the crack of a spear thrown true. Life balanced on a knife's edge, but within that danger there was also meaning. To wander was to become. Every step taken into the unknown reshaped what it meant to be human. The ice was never a passive backdrop. It dictated where rivers flowed, where animals grazed, where people could settle. It forced migration routes, sometimes opening land bridges when seas fell, sometimes cutting them off, when glaciers melted and waters rose. Our ancestors crossed into lands that would one day be called Europe, Asia, Australia, the Americas, all guided by the push and pull of ice. Each crossing was a gamble, but each gamble made us more. Even now, I feel the echo of their footsteps. The wanderers of ice and steppe didn't just spread across the earth. They spread across time, embedding themselves in us. Every breath I take in cold air, every moment I stand before a vast horizon, I feel them. We are their continuation. The journey that began in Africa under shifting skies has never truly ended. I have often thought of ice as an artist, a sculptor working with a patience beyond our comprehension. Where we measure time in hours or years, glaciers work in millennia. They slide forward almost imperceptibly, yet with a strength that reshapes entire continents. When the Ice Age pressed its hands upon the earth, it left behind landscapes that still speak today. Stand in a U-shaped valley in the Alps or the Rockies, and you can see the signature of ice carved into stone. Once these were V-shaped cuts made by rivers, narrow and steep. But when glaciers filled them, their immense weight ground the walls into sweeping arcs. Moraines' long ridges of debris mark the edges where the ice once paused like brushstrokes left on canvas. Erratic boulders carried for hundreds of miles sit stranded in fields where no mountain exists, silent witnesses to journeys of ice. Loess plains, fine fertile soils, ground from rock dust, spread where the glaciers breathed out, feeding future civilizations. Even great floods unleashed when ice dams broke scoured entire regions and left behind channeled landscapes that to us seem otherworldly. I remember standing once on the surface of a glacier in Iceland. The air was sharp. The ice groaned beneath my boots, and rivulets of meltwater cut blue channels into the white. It felt alive. I could hear it creak and shift as though it were breathing. Beneath me, hundreds of meters of ice pressed down on ancient stone, grinding, sculpting, moving forward grain by grain. To realize that this slow, relentless force shaped the world where humans grew was overwhelming. The mountains we admire, the valleys we farm, the rivers we follow, so many of them are gifts of ice. But glaciers did more than carve the land. They shaped the path of humanity. When ice sheets locked up vast amounts of water, sea levels fell, revealing bridges of land. One such bridge connected Siberia to Alaska, a frozen highway into the Americas. Others tied islands together, turning scattered stepping stones into passages. Without the sculptor's hand of ice, many of our migrations would not have been possible. The land itself opened to us because of the glacier's grip. Yet ice also closed doors. When glaciers advanced, they crushed habitats, forcing people and animals alike to retreat into smaller refuges. Forests disappeared, rivers froze, and fertile land vanished beneath white. In those moments, survival meant adapting quickly or moving on. To live in a world sculpted by ice was to live in constant negotiation with its will. There is something humbling in recognizing that the ground beneath our feet, whether soft farmland or jagged cliffs, was not shaped by us first, but by forces far older. When I look at aerial photographs of landscapes traced with glacial scars, I see a map of human destiny hidden in stone. The valleys became routes of travel. The fertile plains became fields of grain. The rivers cut by melting ice became lifelines for settlements. What the glaciers created, we inherited, and what we inherited became the stage for civilization. But there is another side to this artistry. Ice was both a giver and a destroyer. The same floods that carried fertile soil also drowned valleys. The same grinding that carved mountains also left behind barren expanses where little could grow. For every refuge there was desolation. For every path opened, another was blocked. It was never mercy. It was balance, indifferent and immense. As I stood on that glacier in Iceland, I ran my hand across the rough surface of embedded rock and felt a strange kinship. This was the same kind of ice that once towered over my ancestors, that forced them to adapt, that shaped the places where they sought food and shelter. The sculptor's hands did not only mold mountains, they molded us. Our endurance, our ingenuity, our restless spirit, all of it was sharpened by living in a world remade again and again by ice. And so when I walk today through valleys filled with cities, along rivers lined with farms, or across plains where herds once roamed, I cannot help but see the ghost of glaciers. They are long gone, melted into oceans, yet their fingerprints remain. Every hill, every fertile patch, every winding river is a reminder that we are children of the ice shaped not only in flesh and bone, but in the very ground beneath our feet. When I think of the frozen world, I don't only picture ice and stone. I also see a living stage filled with creatures so immense, so strange, that they seem torn from mythology rather than history. This was the world of the great beasts, the megafauna that thrived beside glaciers and rivers of melt. They were not background characters in our story. They were companions, rivals, teachers, and sometimes victims. To live during the Ice Age was to share the land with giants. The woolly mammoth is perhaps the most famous of them, its image etched into our imagination like a symbol of the Ice Age itself. Covered in thick coats of hair with curved tusks sweeping outward like crescents of ivory, they moved in herds across the steppe. I imagine their trumpeting calls echoing in the frozen air, low rumbles that traveled miles across open plains. For our ancestors, mammoths were a source of food, clothing, shelter, and awe. Their bones built huts, their hides made warmth, their fat burned as fuel. But they were not merely resources. They were challenges that demanded cooperation and ingenuity. Bringing down a mammoth was a feat that no single human could achieve. It took planning tools, strategy, and courage. In that challenge, humans sharpened their unity and intelligence. Beside them stalked the saber-toothed cat's predators with fangs like daggers, sleek and muscular. Ambush hunters built for power rather than speed. Imagine standing on the edge of a forest at dusk, hearing a sudden rustle, and knowing death might leap from the shadows in an instant. To survive such predators, humans had to develop sharper eyes, keener ears, and faster minds. We learned not just to fight, but to anticipate, to sense danger before it struck. Our vigilance, our storytelling about where predators lurked, was as much a defense as our spears. There were others too, woolly rhinoceroses with their massive horns sweeping like scythes, musk oxen with thick coats bristling against the wind, giant ground sloths that towered over horns like living walls of fur and muscle. In the Americas, enormous short-faced bears prowled, creatures so large they could look a human in the eye even when on all fours. To see one must have been to know what true power looked like. And yet, somehow fragile humans lived alongside them, neither the biggest nor the strongest, but the cleverest. I often think about how those animals shaped not only our survival, but our imagination. Early cave paintings show mammoths, bison, horses, lions, and bears. These were not idle doodles. They were acts of reverence, memory, and perhaps magic. To paint a mammoth was to acknowledge its importance, to capture its spirit, maybe even to summon success in the next hunt. The beasts were part of our minds as much as our world. They walked not only through our valleys, but through our dreams. It's easy to forget how fragile that balance was. The megafauna thrived because the world of ice and grass favored them. Open steppes provided endless grazing. Cold climates reduced disease. Vast territories allowed them to roam and grow enormous. But when the climate shifted, when glaciers retreated and forests returned, the giants began to falter. Grasslands shrank, food grew scarce, and humans, now skilled hunters, pressed harder. One by one, the titans began to disappear. I imagine what it must have felt like for a group of humans to stand over the carcass of a fallen mammoth, not just with triumph, but with a sense of gravity. They had slain a creature older and stronger than themselves, a mountain of life. The meat would feed them for weeks, the hides warm their children, the tusks become tools and ornaments. But somewhere, perhaps in the quiet of the night, they must have felt a weight, a recognition that in taking the life of giants, they were altering the world itself. Some scientists argue that humans alone caused the extinction of many megafauna. Others say it was the warming climate that doomed them, and humans were only part of the pressure. The truth may be both, but either way, the loss was immense. Imagine walking through Europe 40,000 years ago and seeing mammoths and woolly rhinos, then returning 20,000 years later to find only emptiness. To our ancestors, the disappearance of such beasts must have felt like the vanishing of gods, and yet traces remain. Mammoth bones still rise from melting permafrost, their tusks smooth and curved like frozen moons. In some places, preserved carcasses lie in the ground with hair and flesh intact, as if waiting to awaken. When I read about them, I feel a strange ache, as though I am missing something I never knew. Perhaps we all carry that ache. The myths of dragons, giants and monstrous beasts may be echoes of memories passed down from those who once lived among true titans. The beasts were not just scenery. They were tests. To live alongside them forced humans to sharpen every skill: hunting, tracking, planning, cooperation, imagination. The beasts gave us fear, but they also gave us courage. They gave us food, but also meaning. Their presence demanded more of us than the world of forests ever had. And in answering that demand, we became more human. When I look at the painted walls of Chauvet Cave, where lions prowl and mammoths march across stone, I don't just see art. I see a memory of relationship. Those early artists were saying, we lived among them and they shaped us. Their images are not only records of animals long gone, but of a world that made us who we are. To this day, when I walk through an open plain in winter and see the horizon stretch wide, I can almost imagine a dark shape moving at the edge of vision. A mammoth, a lion, something massive and alive. The world feels emptier without them, but their echo lingers. The Ice Age beasts are gone, yet they remain in our bones, in our stories, and in the very way we learn to survive. When I think of the Ice Age, I don't only see ice and beasts. I see people, our ancestors, living in ways that to us feel almost unimaginable. Yet they were the foundation of everything we are today. These were the makers of stone and fire, the wanderers of valleys and steppes, the storytellers whose words vanished into the night, but whose spirit endured. They lived at the edge of survival, but they also lived at the edge of invention. Stone was their first great companion. A simple rock shaped by steady hands became a tool sharper than bone, harder than wood. At first, flakes struck from one stone to another were enough sharp edges to cut, meat, scrape hides, dig roots. But with time came skill. Humans learned to read the stone itself, to feel the angle, the grain, the strike that would make it split just right. From this grew axe scrapers, spear points, objects of survival that were also objects of knowledge. To hold such a tool was to hold generations of practice passed from hand to hand across centuries. I've stood in a museum staring at such tools chipped 500,000 years ago and felt the weight of their meaning. They are more than stones. They are the first sparks of memory made solid. With tools came new ways of living. Animals once too dangerous to approach could be hunted. Hides could be scraped into clothing, bones shaped into needles. Suddenly the cold was less of a master and humans less of a victim. I imagine a woman sitting by a fire, sewing fur with bone thread, her child beside her. Outside the wind howls, but inside there is warmth, protection, continuity. That is the moment where humanity takes a step away from mere survival toward shaping its destiny. Shelter grew more elaborate too. Caves became homes, but so did huts built from mammoth bones and hides arranged with care, lit by hearths at their center. These were not random shelters. They were planned, structured, shared. Within them, humans learned to live not as scattered individuals but as communities. The bond of blood became the bond of tribe. To eat together, to huddle together, to sleep under one roof was to discover the strength of belonging. And with belonging came language. Its origins are lost, but I can almost hear the first experiments in speech gestures giving way to sounds, sounds becoming patterns, patterns growing into meaning. At first, perhaps just warnings, lion fire water. Then names, memories, questions. Language was a revolution as profound as fire. It allowed thought to leap from one mind to another, allowed experience to outlive the body. It bound groups not only in the present, but across generations. Around the fire, words became threads, weaving people together into something larger than themselves. I think often about those nights. A group gathered close, flames crackling, shadows dancing on cave walls. An elder speaks, recalling where herds once passed, where rivers flowed before the last freeze. Children listen, wide-eyed, their minds absorbing the world through story. In those moments, humanity was not only surviving, it was becoming self-aware. It was remembering. It was imagining. Art emerged alongside this awakening. On cave walls, in carved bone, in beads of shell, people began to express what they saw and what they dreamed. A mammoth drawn in ochre, a lion traced in charcoal, a hand pressed against stone. These were not mere decorations. They were declarations. We were here. We saw. We felt. To paint an animal was to honor it, to carry its spirit into memory. To press a handprint on stone was to defy time, to say, across thousands of years I existed. The Ice Age world was harsh, but it gave birth to beauty. From necessity came tools, from tools came art, from art came meaning. Each invention was an answer to hardship, but each answer also opened new questions. What else could stone become? What else could fire do? What else could voices tell? Sometimes when I walk through a modern city and see towers of steel, hear voices carried across continents by invisible signals, I remind myself all of this began with chipped flint and whispered words around a fire. The distance between us and them is vast in time, but not in essence. The same spark that guided their hands guides ours. The same hunger to shape the world, to remember to imagine it, is the same flame burning still. And so when I picture those early people, I don't see primitives lost in cold darkness. I see inventors, artists, dreamers. I see the first engineers, the first storytellers, the first teachers. They may have walked in furs with stone tools, but their minds were already reaching forward, already sketching the outlines of everything to come. What fascinates me most about the Ice Age is not only what humans created, but how the land itself shaped where they could go and how they could live. Geography was not just a backdrop, it was destiny. The rhythm of glaciers advancing and retreating opened doors, one century and slammed them shut the next. The world was a shifting puzzle, and our ancestors were forced to solve it with every step. When glaciers grew, they locked vast amounts of water into ice. Sea levels dropped and continents stretched outward. In those moments, the earth revealed hidden bridges. One of the most famous was the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska Beringia, a wide expanse of grassland that connected Asia and North America. Imagine standing there 40,000 years ago, cold winds whipping across endless steppe, mammoth herds grazing where today waves crash in the Bering Strait. Without the ice lowering the seas, that passage would never have existed. Humanity's journey into the Americas was carved by glaciers. Other bridges appeared as well. Islands in Southeast Asia were linked into great stepping stones, making the journey toward Australia possible. In Europe, frozen rivers and plains provided corridors for hunters to follow herds deep into the continent. The world's geography bent and shifted with the ice as if the planet itself were rearranging paths for migration. But the same ice that opened ways also closed them. When glaciers advanced, they swallowed valleys, forests, and rivers. Habitats vanished. Populations were squeezed into smaller refugee pockets of warmth where plants and animals still survived. These places became cradles of survival, where small groups of humans endured while others perished. Entire lineages may have vanished in the tightening grip of ice, while a few lucky or clever bands carried the thread forward. One of the most dramatic changes came with the shaping of rivers. As glaciers melted, torrents of water carved channels, created lakes, and sometimes burst through natural dams in cataclysmic floods. The landscapes of North America bear these scars, giant ripple marks in stone-dry coulees carved by walls of water. To humans living, then such floods must have seemed like the anger of gods, unstoppable forces that erased everything in their path. But they also left behind fertile valleys, rich with new life once the waters receded. The Ice Age was never stable. Climate swung back and forth, sometimes over centuries, sometimes within a single lifetime. A child born into a world of grassland might grow old in a forest, her grandchildren facing snow where she once saw flowers. To live in such a world meant to accept change as constant. Movement was not a choice, but a necessity. Humans learned to read the signs of the land, the migration of animals, the patterns of rivers, the shifting of seasons. Geography became knowledge, and knowledge became survival. What I find extraordinary is how these movements shaped who we are. Migration demanded flexibility. Groups that stayed too fixed often died with the land that failed them. Those who adapted, who took risks and walked into the unknown, carried humanity forward. Each crossing of a land bridge, each journey into a new valley rewrote the map of our species. Even today, our bodies remember those journeys. Genetic studies show how humans spread wave after wave, leaving Africa, reaching Asia, Australia, Europe, and finally the Americas. Every one of us carries the trace of those ancient footsteps. The lines in our DNA are like paths across a frozen earth, routes carved by necessity, courage, and geography. When I think about this, I realize something profound. The ice did not just sculpt mountains and rivers, it sculpted us. It dictated where we could walk, whom we could meet, what we could eat, and how we could endure. Our story is written not only in firelight and stone, but in valleys carved by glaciers and bridges revealed by the sea. What strikes me most about this long journey through the Ice Age is how humans did not merely adapt to the land, but learned to shape it in return. Until this point in our story, we had been wanderers, followers of herds, seekers of rivers, children of geography. But as time passed, something shifted. The environment was still master, but humans began to bend it little by little to their needs. That slow change marked the beginning of the path that would one day lead to civilization. At first, shaping the land was simple necessity. Fire was the earliest tool not only for warmth, but for altering the world around us. Our ancestors burned grasslands to drive animals into the open, reshaping habitats for the sake of a hunt. A patch of forest set aflame became new pasture where grazers would return, and so the hunters followed. Without realizing it, humans were already playing a role in ecosystems, turning chance landscapes into managed ones. Fire was not just survival. It was the first instrument of control. Shelter was another step. Caves had long provided protection, but people began to build in places where stone offered no cover. Mammoth bones formed frames for huts, hides stretched across wooden poles, stones stacked into circles to block the wind. These were not random shelters. They were chosen, arranged, remembered. Over generations, certain valleys became favored places to return to, and certain caves bore layer upon layer of hearths and tools. What began as temporary camps grew into the rhythm of settlement. Though still nomadic humans were slowly weaving themselves into the land, hunting itself grew more sophisticated. Spears were no longer just sharpened sticks. They were tipped with stone points, balanced with foresight, and thrown with the aid of spear throwers that extended reach and power. Later, bows and arrows would transform the hunt even further. Each improvement meant that animals once too fast or too dangerous could now be faced. With those tools, humans not only survived in new environments but thrived. They expanded into colder regions, higher mountains, denser forests. Geography no longer dictated limits in the same way. We were learning to bend its rules, but the land pressed back. Every ice age advance brought scarcity. Herds shifted plants, disappeared rivers, froze. In these hard times, humans turned inward, drawing on community and memory. Knowledge became the greatest survival tool. Which valleys held edible roots even in the frost? Which caves trapped warmth from the sun? Which stones chipped best into blades? Such wisdom spoken across fires and etched into memory was itself a kind of map. Geography was no longer just physical, it became cultural. written into stories, songs, and lessons. The shaping of the land also happened in smaller, quieter ways. In some regions, humans began to carry seeds and tubers from place to place, not yet farming, but noticing plants grow where they are dropped, berries return where they are scattered. Over thousands of years, these small habits would build into something larger. But even here, at the edge of prehistory, we see the hints, the human desire not only to take from the land, but to guide it. What fascinates me most is how this interaction between humans and environment created diversity. Groups that lived near coasts turned to fishing and shellfish, leaving behind piles of shells that still mark their camps. Those in forests learned the habits of deer and boar, while steppe hunters specialized in mammoths and bison. Mountain dwellers mastered stone and shelter. Desert wanderers mastered patience and water. The Ice Age world was not one uniform struggle, but 1,000 different experiments in survival. Geography was the teacher, but each community wrote its own answer. And then there were the crossings. Those moments when geography reshaped everything at once. When seas fell and land bridges appeared, humans took risks that would echo forever. The crossing into Australia, more than 50,000 years ago, demanded not only land travel, but some form of watercraft rafts or canoes made of wood and reed. To imagine that leap fills me with awe. A group of wanderers staring across waters at faint shapes of land chose to push forward into the unknown. They carried fire tools and memory, and with them they carried humanity itself into a new continent. Later, the passage into the Americas would be just as transformative. The land bridge of Beringia was vast, but beyond it lay an ice wall that blocked the way south. Only when the glaciers retreated did humans pour into the new world, spreading across thousands of miles with astonishing speed. Within a few thousand years, they reached the tip of South America, filling an entire hemisphere with their presence. Geography opened the door, and humans with their resilience stepped through it. All of this was made possible by the constant dialogue between people and the land. We were shaped by ice rivers and plains, but we also shaped them in turn. Each fire set, each shelter, built, each seed dropped, was a statement: we are no longer only guests here. We belong, and we will make this place ours. When I stand today on a hill overlooking a wide plain, I see not just land, but memory. The ridges shaped by glaciers, the valleys carved by rivers, the stones scattered by ice. All of them were once guides and obstacles for people long before us. And I wonder, did they stand in this same place, looking out, feeling both fear and possibility? Did they see what I see? A land vast, cold, beautiful, and waiting to be shaped. In the end, geography was never just a force acting upon us. It was a partner in the great story. It pushed, we adapted. It closed, we waited. It opened, we crossed. And in that back and forth, humans became who we are: restless, inventive, unwilling to stand still. Geography gave us limits, and in overcoming them, we learned to transcend. As I traced this journey further, I realized that survival during the Ice Age was not only about tools or landscapes, it was about people, about the bonds that held small groups together when the world seemed impossibly hostile. Without cooperation, humanity would never have endured. The cold, the predators, the hunger, all of these would have broken individuals. But together, humans found a strength greater than any spear. I imagine a band of 30 or 40 moving across the steppe, families bound by blood, but also by necessity. Elders walking slower at the rear, children carried or tugged along, hunters scouting ahead. Within this group, every life depended on the others. One person alone might survive for a time, but in the long winters, isolation was death. Food had to be shared, watch kept at night. Fires tended, skills passed down. The tribe was not just community, it was the line between existence and extinction. Within these groups, roles emerged naturally. Some were skilled hunters, others skilled gatherers of roots and herbs. There were those who remembered the old paths, the safe caves, the places where water could be found. There were those who healed with plants, those who taught the young, those who carried fire. In this way, knowledge was distributed, not locked in a single person, but woven into the fabric of the tribe. If one fell, others carried the memory. That weaving of skills and stories was humanity's true survival strategy. What fascinates me is how cooperation went beyond mere necessity. Archaeological evidence shows care for the injured and the weak. Bones of Neanderthals have been found with healed fractures that would have left them unable to hunt or gather for months, even years. They lived because others fed and protected them. This was not instinct alone, it was compassion. Somewhere in those cold valleys, humans and their cousins chose to care for one another even when resources were scarce. That choice speaks of something profound, the birth of empathy as a force of survival. Fire circles became more than warmth and food. They became theaters of social life. Here disputes were settled, plans made, stories told. Around the flames, laughter and song grew, weaving bonds that went deeper than blood. Music, too, left its traces, flutes carved from bird bones, simple but haunting, capable of filling caves with sound. I imagine a cold night softened by the rhythm of hands on hollow logs, voices rising together in song. Such moments were not luxury, they were glue. They turned fragile gatherings into enduring communities. Partnership stretched beyond human to animal as well. Wolves, drawn by the scraps of camps, lingered at the edges of firelight. Some were chased away, but others lingered closer, and humans must have seen in them something familiar. Eyes that watched, instincts that hunted, loyalty to pack. Slowly, a bond formed. Over generations, wolves became companions, protectors, hunters at our side. From this bond came dogs, the first domesticated animals allies that walked with us into every new land. That relationship, born in the frozen dark, was one of the most transformative in our story. Even burial practices reveal the depth of these bonds. Graves from tens of thousands of years ago show careful placement of bodies, sometimes with tools, sometimes with ornaments. This was more than disposal of the dead. It was remembrance ritual, perhaps belief. To bury the dead with care is to acknowledge their place in the community, even after life has ended. It is to say, you still belong. That sense of belonging, extending beyond death-bound groups with invisible threads of memory and meaning. In such fragile worlds, trust was everything. A broken promise, a theft, an act of betrayal could doom not just one person, but many. So trust became sacred. Bonds were reinforced through shared meals, shared hunts, shared dangers. The very act of sitting around a fire passing food from hand to hand was a ritual of solidarity. To eat together was to affirm we are one, and together we endure. Looking back, it seems clear that our humanity was forged not only in struggle against the cold, but in connection to one another. Intelligence alone was not enough. Tools alone were not enough. What kept the flame alive through countless winters was the bond of shared lives. It was the laughter at night, the care for the weak, the teaching of the young, the honoring of the dead. These invisible bonds were as vital as the sharpest spear. And so, when I think about the Ice Age, I don't only see landscapes of ice and beasts. I see circles of firelight, faces glowing in the dark, hands reaching across to share food voices, rising in song. I see the quiet strength of togetherness, the force that carried us through when everything else seemed set against us. What grew out of these circles of fire and bonds of kinship was something even more remarkable. The birth of imagination in a form we can still see today, art symbolism, and the beginnings of belief. When I think of the Ice Age, I don't only imagine the hunts and migrations, but also the moments when humans turned inward, looked at the world, and asked questions that had no simple answers. The caves of Europe tell this story most vividly. Places like Chauvet Altamira and Lascaux are filled with animals, painted in ochre charcoal and mineral pigments. Lions prowl in packs across stone walls, mammoths march in herds, bison clash with horns lowered. Some are painted with astonishing skill, with shading and movement that suggest not just observation, but artistry. To enter one of these caves is to step into a cathedral of the Ice Age, a place where darkness was transformed by firelight into a living gallery of memory. But why did they paint? That question haunts me. Some say the images were rituals, painted to summon good fortune in the hunt. Others say they were teaching tools, ways of showing young hunters what animals looked like, how they moved. Still others believe they were spiritual expressions of awe before creatures that seemed larger than life. Perhaps they were all of these. Perhaps they were something more, an early expression of the human need to create, to take what is fleeting and make it endure. Art was not confined to walls. Bones were carved into figurines, ivory shaped into animals, stone chipped into beads. The so-called Venus figurines, small carvings of women with exaggerated forms, have been found from France to Siberia. Were they fertility symbols, expressions of beauty, or something else entirely? We may never know. But what they tell us is clear. Ice Age people did not see the world only in terms of survival. They shaped objects for meaning, for expression, for something beyond the practical. Even music appears here. Flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory, tuned carefully with holes, drilled at precise intervals, suggest that song filled the air tens of thousands of years ago. Imagine a group gathered in a cave, firelight flickering as a melody rises and echoes off stone. Music is more than sound. It is connection, rhythm, shared emotion. To play and to listen together is to be bound by something unseen, something that moves the spirit as much as the body. And alongside art and music came belief. The careful burials, the painted animals, the carved figures all hint at a world where humans saw life as more than flesh and bone. Death was not just an end, but a passage. Animals were not just prey, but beings with spirits that demanded respect. Nature itself was not silent but alive, filled with forces to be honored, feared, or appeased. This was the dawn of spirituality, of myth of the unseen world that would one day blossom into religion. I imagine a shaman figure, perhaps draped in animal hides, perhaps painted with ash, sitting by a fire speaking of dreams and visions. He tells of the bison spirit that must be honored, of the cave lion that carries power, of the ancestors who watch from beyond. Around him, the tribe listens, their faces lit by flame. Whether or not his words were true did not matter. What mattered was the meaning they carried, the unity they gave. Belief itself was a tool of survival, binding people together, giving them courage in the face of a world that seemed vast and merciless. What is striking is how modern these impulses feel. When I see those ancient paintings, when I hear the faint tones of a reconstructed flute, I don't see strangers. I see us. The same drive that led them to paint animals on stone drives us to create art today. The same impulse that led them to bury their dead with care leads us to hold funerals, to write epitaphs to remember. The same need to imagine, to believe in something larger still shapes us in temples, stories and dreams. The Ice Age gave us more than tools and survival. It gave us the spark of culture, the sense that life is not only about food and shelter, but about meaning. Around the fire, in the deep caves, in the carvings and songs, humanity began to speak not just of what is, but of what might be, of what lies beyond. That leap, the leap into imagination, is what made us fully human. And so when I think of those cold nights, I do not only see fear and hunger. I see beauty born from hardship, creativity born from struggle, faith born from fragility. I see the first artists, the first musicians, the first dreamers. They looked at the same stars. We look at now and wondered the same questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What comes after? Their answers were painted in ochre and sung in hollow bones, but their wonder lives on in us. If art and belief marked the dawn of imagination, then the Ice Age also marked something else just as profound, the beginning of our relationship with other species. This was the era when humans began to weave animals into their lives not only as prey or predators, but as partners. That partnership, fragile at first, would grow into one of the most transformative forces in human history. The earliest and most significant of these companions was the wolf. I picture the scene, a group of humans huddled around their fire meat, roasting on the flames, scraps tossed aside. In the darkness beyond the circle of light, a pair of eyes gleams watchful, hungry, hesitant. Wolves had always been near, competing for prey, sometimes threatening humans themselves. But here, something shifted. Instead of chasing them away, perhaps a few scraps were left behind. Perhaps certain wolves lingered, less aggressive, more curious. Over time, a cautious trust grew. Wolves with calmer temperaments stayed closer to the firelight, learning that humans could mean food, warmth, safety. Humans in turn noticed that wolves had sharp senses, that they barked warnings at predators, that they could follow scents no human nose could trace. Slowly, generation by generation, a bond formed. Wolves became dogs. And with that bond, a new kind of partnership entered the human story, the domesticated animal. This was not just companionship. Dogs changed survival itself. They helped track game-guarded camps and offered warmth in the cold. They became extensions of human perception, hearing what we could not hear, smelling what we could not smell. They also became symbols, spirits of loyalty and guardianship. Burial sites showed dogs laid to rest with humans, sometimes with ornaments, as if their bond extended beyond life. To live with a dog was to live with a partner who was both family and tool, protector and friend. But dogs were not the only animals to enter human orbits. Even before true farming people were experimenting with ways to shape the behavior of the creatures around them. Reindeer hunted for meat and hides were also observed for their migrations tracked across vast distances. Over time, small steps toward taming certain animals began. Not yet full domestication, but hints. A calf raised a young animal, tethered a herd guided by fire or fences of wood. Humans were beginning to realize that animals were not only to be chased and killed, but could be guided, managed, even partnered with. This shift was revolutionary. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had lived as hunters and gatherers, dependent entirely on the rhythms of the land. But the beginnings of domestication dogs by the fire reindeer, nudged into herds, wild plants scattered near camp, hinted at a future where humans would not only adapt to the land, but bend it entirely to their will. The seeds of farming and herding were being planted long before the first true fields or flocks, and with this came deeper meaning. Animals were not just bodies of meat. They became symbols, spirits' teachers. The paintings on cave walls were not portraits of prey alone. Lions, bison, mammoths, and horses all carried weight beyond the hunt. They were totems of power, embodiments of forces larger than human life. To paint a bison was perhaps to ask for its strength. To carve a horse was to honor its speed. These animals were woven into myth and story, not as mere resources, but as beings with roles in the unseen world. Burials also reveal this connection. Some graves contain not only tools and ornaments, but animal bones carefully placed. A reindeer antler beside a human skull. A fox laid next to its human companion. These were not accidents. They suggest relationships of respect, companionship, even reverence. Humans were beginning to see themselves not as separate from animals, but as part of a shared circle of life and death. This relationship extended into ritual. Some archaeologists believe that certain sites filled with the bones of particular animals arranged in patterns were ceremonial. Perhaps they were places where humans gathered to honor the herds they hunted, to ask forgiveness, to give thanks, or to strengthen the bond between hunter and prey. If true, this is extraordinary. It means that even before farming, even before cities, humans saw themselves in relationship with the animal world in a spiritual sense. I often imagine the first moment when a child reached out to touch a wolf pup, by the fire when laughter rang out at its playful bite, or the moment when a hunter, instead of killing a young reindeer, chose to guide it back to camp. These small gestures, repeated countless times, shaped the path of humanity. They remind me that history is not only grand migrations and battles, but tiny acts of curiosity, patience, and connection. And this connection has never left us. The animals of the Ice Age are gone, but the relationships forged there endure. Every dog lying by a fireplace today is the descendant of wolves who once lingered at the edge of human camps. Every herd of cattle or flock of sheep owes its existence to the first hesitant experiments in guiding wild creatures. Even the stories we tell, filled with animals as symbols and companions, are echoes of the myths whispered by firelight in caves long ago. This, to me, is the heart of the Ice Age's legacy. Not just survival against the cold, but the discovery that survival was stronger when shared with one another, and shared with the animals who walked beside us. The first partnerships we formed beyond our own species set us on a course that would transform the world. In the bond between human and animal, I see the beginnings of civilization itself. What fascinates me as I move deeper into this story is how climate itself became a silent architect of our destiny. The Ice Age was never one long winter but a rhythm of freezes and thaws, of glaciers advancing and retreating like a vast breath across the earth. These swings in climate were not background noise. They were the stage upon which every drama of human survival played out. Each change brought both peril and possibility, forcing us to adapt or vanish. Imagine a family born during a colder phase. The land around them is treeless tundra, endless grass, broken only by windswept hills. Herds of mammoths and bison move like dark rivers across the horizon, followed by hunters who depend on them. The air is sharp food, scarce winters long. Children grow up learning to endure cold as a constant companion, to walk miles for meat and water. Then, within a few generations, the glaciers retreat. Forests return rivers, swell herds vanish into greener lands. The same valley that once fed mammoths now echoes with birdsong and deer. To survive, humans must change everything: their tools, their diets, even their ways of moving through the world. These shifts were not rare. Over tens of thousands of years, climate swung back and forth, sometimes gradually, sometimes violently. A cold snap could transform abundance into famine. A sudden warming could flood valleys, drown hunting grounds, and unleash diseases from melting ice. To live in the Ice Age was to live in uncertainty, to know that the world itself could turn against you at any moment. And yet these changes were also teachers. They demanded flexibility. Humans who clung too tightly to one way of living often failed, while those who experimented, who dared to try new foods, new tools, new paths, survived. This is one reason why Homo sapiens endured while other human species faded. Neanderthals, for example, were extraordinary hunters, superbly adapted to cold Europe. But when climates shifted, their specialization became a trap. Our ancestors, less specialized but more adaptable, shifted diets, moved territories, adjusted strategies. In the long run, it was not the strongest who endured, but the most flexible. Climate also forged migration. When the world warmed, ice melted and seas rose, cutting off land bridges and isolating groups. When the world cooled, seas fell, revealing new paths. These fluctuations scattered humans across the globe. Each wave of migration carried not just people, but languages, tools, beliefs, and stories. Every shoreline crossed, every valley entered, was written by the pen of climate. There is something humbling in realizing how deeply our fate was tied to forces far beyond our control. A shift in temperature by only a few degrees could decide whether whole populations thrived or disappeared. Entire regions that are fertile today were once barren under ice, and lands now drowned beneath oceans once carried human footsteps. The Earth we know is only the latest version of a world constantly reshaped by climate's hand. And yet, in those shifting conditions, humans did more than survive, they innovated. When forests spread, they learned to craft bows for hunting deer in dense cover. When plains expanded, they refined spear throwers to strike from a distance across open steppe. When rivers flooded, they built rafts and canoes. When animals vanished, they turned to fish seeds and roots. Climate tested us, and every test forced us to grow. It also shaped our minds. To endure unpredictable change, humans learned to think ahead, to imagine not just the world as it was, but as it might become. This foresight planning for seasons, storing food, migrating before resources failed, was the seed of future civilization. In a sense, climate forced us to invent the future. When I look at our world today, I cannot help but see echoes of those ancient struggles. We still live under the rule of climate, though now shaped by our own hands as much as by glaciers. The floods, droughts, and storms we face remind me that we have always lived at the mercy of Earth's breath. But I also remember that we have always endured, always adapted, always found ways to bend with the changes rather than break. In the Ice Age, climate was both destroyer and creator. It took lives, shattered homes, and erased landscapes. But it also pushed us to move, to invent, to imagine. Without its swings, perhaps we would never have spread so far, never have learned so much, never have become what we are. In every gust of Ice's Age wind, in every retreat of glacier, there was a challenge. And in answering those challenges, humanity became itself. As I come to the end of this journey through the Ice Age, I feel a deep stillness settle in me. We have walked together through frozen plains and deep caves, stood beside mammoths and lions, listened to the music of bone flutes and the whispers of firelight. We have seen how glaciers shaped the land, how people adapted, how bonds of kinship, art, and belief carried fragile lives through endless winters. And now, looking back, what strikes me most is not the hardship alone, but the resilience. Our ancestors were not only survivors, they were dreamers, creators, and seekers of meaning. Out of cold and hunger, they drew beauty. Out of fear, they found courage. Out of uncertainty, they built hope. The Ice Age was not just an age of struggle. It was the crucible where humanity was forged. When I think of them, I feel connected across the millennia. Their hands shaped the first tools, but their hearts shaped the first stories. Those stories, painted on cave walls, carved in bone, sung in dark caverns, are still alive in us. Every time we imagine, every time we create, every time we wonder, we walk the same path they once walked. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the Ice Age, that even in the harshest times, we carry within us a light that refuses to go out. It is the fire we tend together, the bond that binds us, the dream that pushes us forward. Ice may cover the land, but it cannot freeze the human spirit. Thank you, my friends, for walking with me through this story. Thank you for listening, for imagining, for sharing this journey beyond time and ice. If you have enjoyed this video, please remember to subscribe to Beyond Earth Stories so you can follow the next chapters we will explore together. Until then, I wish you peace in your life, warmth in your days, and strength in your heart.